The Unconditional. We have already stressed that it is the ethical aspect of Kant's text on lying that has provoked the most indignation and discomfort among his critics. The ethical problem, to leave behind the framework imposed by Constant's example and formulated more generally as a structural problem, can be expressed as follows. Can humanity, or more precisely, love of our fellow man, justify us in making an exception to the moral law, provided that there is a conflict between the two? Not much thought is required to answer this question, given the fundamental principles of Kantian ethics. There is only one moral good, defined as an act accomplished in conformity with duty, and strictly for the sake of duty. If my act conforms with duty, and if it is, at the same time, accomplished only for the sake of duty, which would mean, in the case we are discussing, that if I tell the murderer the truth, it is not out of fear, then it is an ethical act. In spite of this, however, Kant's position on this question remains ambiguous in the grounding for the metaphysics of morals and in the critique of practical reason, especially because of the examples he chooses to illustrate his point. In the Ethics of Psychoanalysis, Lacan calls attention to this ambiguity. At the end of the chapter, Love of One's Neighbor, he focuses on the famous example Kant gives in the second critique, the parable of the gallows. The parable goes like this. Suppose that someone says his lust is irresistible when the desired object and opportunity are present. Ask him whether he would not control his passions if, in front of the house where he has this opportunity, a gallows were erected, on which he would be hanged immediately after gratifying his lust. We do not have to guess very long what his answer may be, but ask him whether he thinks it would be possible for him to overcome his love of life, however great it may be, if his sovereign threatened him with the same sudden death, unless he made a false deposition against an honorable man whom the ruler wished to destroy under a plausible pretext. Whether he would or not, he would perhaps not venture to say, but that it would be possible for him, he would certainly admit without hesitation. He judges, therefore, that he has to do something because he knows that he ought. Let us put aside for the moment the first part of this parable and focus on the second, which is supposed to illustrate the way the moral law imposes itself upon the human subject, even if this requires the ultimate sacrifice. What is wrong with Kant's argument in this part? Lacan remarks, in effect, if an assault on the goods, the life, or the honor of someone else were to become a universal rule, that would throw the whole of man's universe into a state of disorder and evil. We must not overlook the irony implicit in this remark. Lacan criticizes Kant for introducing a consummately pathological motive hidden behind the facade of a pure moral duty. In other words, Lacan criticizes Kant for cheating. Kant, our dear Kant, in all his innocence, his innocent subterfuge. Kant deceives his readers by disguising the true stakes and the true impact of this ethical choice. In his example, he puts the categorical imperative, our duty, on the same side as the good, the well-being of our fellow men. As a result, the reader will most probably follow Kant without much hesitation when he says that in this case, the idea of accepting one's own death is, at least, possible. The problem lies in the fact that the reader follows Kant here not because she is convinced of the inexorability of duty as such, but because the image of the pain inflicted on the other serves as a counterpoint. Kant's example is destined to produce in us a certain effect of a fortiori, Lacan, as a result of which we are deceived about the real stakes of the choice. In other words, the reader will agree with Kant for, if we may put it like this, non-principled reasons. She will agree with Kant on the grounds of an a fortiori reasoning, not because she is convinced of the a priori value of the moral law, but on the basis of a stronger reason. We accept Kant's argument because we are guided by a certain representation of the good, in which we situate our duty. And this is heteronomy in the strictest Kantian sense of the word. If we bear in mind that the central novelty of Kantian ethics, the point of the Copernican revolution in ethics, consists in reversing the hierarchy between the notion of the good and the moral law, then the very least we can say about the examples discussed is that it obscures this crucial point. This is why Lacan suggests that we change the example a little in order to elucidate the real issue. What if I find myself in a situation where my duty and the good of the other are on opposite sides, and where I can accomplish my duty only to the detriment of my fellow man? Will I stop before the evil, the pain that my action will inflict on the other, or will I stick to my duty, despite the consequences? It is only this case that allows us to see whether what is at issue is the attack on the rights of the other, as far as he is my fellow man, or whether it is, rather, a question of false testimony as such. Thus, Lacan invites us to consider the case of a true witness, a case of conscience which is raised, for example, if I am summoned to inform on my neighbor or my brother for activities which threaten the security of the community. Lacan comments on what is at stake in this case. Quote, "Must I go toward my duty of truth, insofar as it preserves the authentic place of my jouissance, even if it is empty? Or must I resign myself to this lie, which, by making me substitute forcefully the good for the principle of my jouissance, commands me to blow alternately hot and cold?" End of quote. Indeed, it is in the choice between these alternatives that the crucial issue of Kantian ethics is formulated in the clearest possible way. If the moral law excludes any prior consideration of the good, then it is clear where this ethics stands in regard to these alternatives. Once the good comes on stage, the question necessarily arises, whose good? This is what Lacan has in mind with blow alternately hot and cold. If I do not betray my brother or my neighbor, I may betray my other countrymen. Who is to decide whose good is more valuable? This is the fundamental deadlock of any ethics based on the notion of the good, be it individualist or communitarian. The project of Kantian ethics is precisely to escape this deadlock, and this is why it is not just a version of traditional ethics, but an irreversible step towards something different. As we have seen, however, Lacan criticizes Kant for not making this point clearly enough. Kant seems to have trouble accepting some of the consequences of his own central theoretical stance. Therefore, Lacan challenges him with this question: must I follow my duty to tell the truth, insofar as it preserves the authentic place of my jouissance, even if this is empty? Or must I resign myself to a lie, which, by making me substitute forcefully the good for the principle of my jouissance, commands me to blow alternately hot and cold. What is most striking about this transhistorical debate between Lacan and Kant is that Kant actually does answer Lacan. While replying to Benjamin Constant on a supposed right to lie because of philanthropic concerns, he actually replies in a much more satisfactory manner to Lacan. It thus remains for us to say a few words about the value of Kant's insistence upon the unconditional character of duty. The subject's pathology, his interests, inclinations, and well-being, prevents him from acting in a strictly ethical way. The final limit of the subject's pathology, however, is to be found not in him, but in the other. When the subject has, so to speak, already bracketed his interests, another obstacle to carrying out his duty still remains: the good of his fellow men. If I find myself in a situation where there is my duty on one side and the good of my fellow men on the other, the latter can constitute an obstacle to the accomplishment of my duty. If I cannot accomplish my duty except to the detriment of others, I can tell myself that I have no choice but to renege on my duty and spare my neighbor. And this claim that I have no choice, while it still remains opposed to freedom and ethics, seems here to be morally justified. This is what constitutes, for Kant, the fundamental, original lie, the proton pseudos. The fundamental lie consists of telling oneself that there was no choice, that the force of circumstances was such that one could not have acted otherwise. If what is at stake is really a lie, if we are really dealing with a case of reneging on our duty, this is never without consequences. The fault and the guilt remain, even though the reason for giving way was good. It is at this point that Kant's ethics encounters the Lacanian ethics of desire. One of the main reasons for the irreducibility of the pathological thus resides in the fact that the ultimate point of the subject's pathology lodges in the other, and that, consequently, a successful act is never without consequences for the other. In relation to this, we should point out that this is a problem for every ethics, not only for Kant. The crucial question is whether we are aware of this extimate and essentially empty point of our being, or whether we try to hide it behind the facade of a good larger than the good of those affected by our actions. An ethics that identifies duty with the good of one's neighbor cannot avoid this problem. In fact, it redoubles it, since it is forced to confront both these questions. 1. Does what we hold to be good of the other also function as such in his/her own judgment? Or are we trying to impose on the other our idea of his/her good? 2. Whose good are we talking about? For there might be several different neighbors to take into account. We might thus ask whether, in the particular case imputed to Kant by Constant, one is really, according to the principles of Kantian ethics, obliged to tell the potential murderer the truth. This question arises especially since the example is so contrived. It is not clear why the subject could not simply reply to the murderer, "I refuse to tell you." Another example might better express the ethical issue at stake here, as well as allow us to outline the framework of the ethics of desire. The example Lacan introduces in his seminar, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. Antigone. Antigone stops at nothing in order to carry out her intention of burying her brother, Polynices. In her persistence, she is not guided by any good, neither her own, the only good awaiting her is burial alive, nor the good of the community represented by Creon. The consequence of Antigone's act is the ruin of the community, the fall of the kingdom. Her starting point is an unconditional must. Polynices must be buried. At a number of points in the drama, Antigone could have stopped and asked herself, is it really worth it? Is it worth insisting on doing this, given the circumstances? In this case, of course, there would be no Antigone. To be sure, there will always be someone willing to defend the point of view that Antigone would have acted even more ethically had she renounced her quest to bury her brother and saved the kingdom. This kind of ethics, however, does not enter the perspective opened by Kant, nor the one discussed by Lacan, for they both reaffirm ethics in a perspective which is far from comfortable. They situate the ethical act in a dimension which is neither the dimension of the law, in the usual socio-juridical sense of the word, nor the dimension of a simple transgression of the law. Antigone is not an activist fighting for human rights that are being trampled down by a tyrannical state, but that of the real. The Sadeian trap. If, however, we accept Kant's position, another trap soon presents itself, the Sadeian trap. The Kantian subject cannot escape the real involved in unconditional duty by hiding behind the image of his fellow men. But neither can this subject hide behind his duty and use duty as an excuse for his actions. As Slavoj Žižek has pointed out, as ethical subject, I cannot say, sorry, I know it was unpleasant, but I couldn't help it. The moral law imposed that act on me as my unconditional duty. On the contrary, the subject is fully responsible for what he refers to as his duty. The type of discourse where I use my duty as an excuse for my actions is perverse, in the strictest sense of the word. Here, the subject attributes to the other, to duty or to the law, the surplus enjoyment he derives from his actions. I am sorry if my actions hurt you, but I only did what the other wanted me to do, so go and talk to it if you have any objections. In this case, the subject is hiding behind the law. In order to illustrate this, let us take an example suggested by Alison. Suppose I have a violent dislike for someone, and have come into possession of a piece of information about him which I know will cause him great pain if he learns of it. With the intent of causing him pain, I decide to inform him of the matter, but I justify this action to myself on the grounds of his right to know. Accordingly, rather than admitting that this is a vicious act of inflicting unnecessary pain on another, I represent it to myself, and perhaps to others, as a laudable act of truth-telling. I might even convince myself that it is my sacred duty. Alison takes this example to illustrate what he calls the self-deception, by means of which we are able to ignore the morally salient factors of a situation. We will take this example, however, as an illustration of something else. The perverse attitude, which consists in presenting our duty as an excuse for our actions. What is more, we are dealing here with a case of double self-deception. The first moment of self-deception is the one pointed out by Allison. We deceive ourselves as to our actual intention, which is to hurt another. But this self-deception is possible only on the basis of another, more fundamental moment of self-deception. It is possible only insofar as we take the content of our duty to be ready-made, pre-existing our involvement in the situation. This is why it would be impossible to expose this person's actions as hypocritical by saying to him, "We know that your real intention was to hurt another person." In this case, he would simply go on asserting hypocritically that he had to master all his strength in order to tell the truth to the other, that he himself suffered enormously when he hurt the other, yet could not avoid it, because it was his duty to do so. The only way to unmask this kind of hypocrite is to ask him, "And where is it written that it is your duty to tell the other what you know? What makes you believe that this is your duty? Are you ready to answer for your duty?" According to the fundamental principles of Kantian ethics, duty is only that which the subject makes his duty. It does not exist somewhere outside, like the Ten Commandments. It is the subject who makes something his duty and has to answer for it. The categorical imperative is not a test which would enable us to make a list, even a list that is not exhaustive, of ethical deeds, a sort of catechism of pure reason, behind which we could hide the surplus enjoyment we derive from our acts. At this point, we can return to Kant's essay on the supposed right to lie because of philanthropic concerns. It is now clear what makes Kant's position unbearable. Not the fact that my duty does not necessarily coincide with the good of my fellow men. This is something that we have to admit as possible. But the fact that Kant takes, in this case, the duty to tell the truth as a ready-made duty, which has passed, once and for all, the test of the categorical imperative, and can thus be written on some master list of commandments, valid for all future generations. It is precisely this gesture that makes it possible for the subject to assume a perverse attitude, to justify his actions by saying that they were imposed upon him by an unconditional duty, to hide behind the moral law and present himself as the mere instrument of its will. Indeed, Kant goes so far as to claim that the subject who tells the murderer the truth is not responsible for the consequences of this action, whereas the subject who tells a lie is fully responsible for the outcome of the situation. Consequently, instead of illustrating the fact that duty is founded only in itself, and that it is precisely this point which allows for the freedom and responsibility of the moral subject, this notorious example, rather, illustrates the case of a pervert who hides the enjoyment he derives from betrayal behind a supposed respect for the law. Let us, however, stress once again that this in itself does not diminish the value of other aspects of the example. It is possible that someone would make it his duty to tell the murderer the truth. Paradoxical as it may sound, this could be an ethical act. What is inadmissible is that the subject claims that his duty was imposed upon him, that he only followed the commandment of the law. This brings us to the core of the relation between the subject and the law. Why is it inadmissible to fulfill once and for all the enigmatic enunciation of the categorical imperative with a statement, i.e., tell the truth, which reduces the law to the list of pre-established commandments? Not simply, as we might suppose, because in this case we neglect all the particular circumstances which may occur in a concrete situation. Not simply because one case is never identical to another, so that in any given situation we can come across a new factor, which we have to take into account when we are making our decision. The situation is a much more radical one. Even if it were possible, say by means of a sufficiently powerful computer, to simulate all possible situations, this would still not imply that we could put together a workable list of ethical decisions corresponding to given situations. The crucial problem of the moral law is not the variability of the situations to which we apply it, but the place or role of the subject in its very constitution, and thus in the constitution of the universal. The reason why the subject cannot be effaced from the structure of the ethical by means of making a list of duties which would absolve the subject of his responsibility and freedom is not the particular, the singular, or the specific, but the universal. That which can in no way be reduced without abolishing ethics as such is not the multicolored variability of every given situation, but the gesture by which every subject, by means of his action, posits the universal, performs a certain operation of universalization. The ethical subject is not an agent of the universal. He does not act in the name of the universal or with its authorization. If this were the case, the subject would be an unnecessary, dispensable element of ethics. The subject is not the agent of the universal, but its agens. For everyone who doesn't know what this means, it is simply the one who performs an action or creates something. Alenka does not explain here. This does not mean simply that the universal is always subjectively mediated, that the law is always subjective, partial, selective, or prejudicial. It does not point towards a certain definition of the universal, but rather towards a definition of the subject. It means that the subject is nothing other than this moment of universalization, of the constitution or determination of the law. The ethical subject is not a subject who brings all his subjective baggage to a given moral situation and allows it to affect things, i.e., by formulating a maxim which corresponds to his personal inclinations, but a subject who is, strictly speaking, born of this situation, who only emerges from it. The ethical subject is the point where the universal comes to itself and achieves its determination.